Welcome back. I'd like to thank you and congratulate you so much for getting through the course on Roman myth, Classics 396 this far, and really glad to see you make your way at last to the final author to be introduced in this course. Now, this particular author's work is included for your consideration, but will not actually be included in the final exam itself. But I do hope that you'll give this work close attention because it's really a fun, entertaining work and a very nice last way to introduce Roman myth. The particular myth that you're going to be looking at along the way as you read the work is the one on Cupid and Psyche, and this is one of the few seemingly original takes on a myth done by the Romans that we have seen all semester. So do pay attention to this work, even though you won't be specifically tested on it, because as I say, it's an entertaining novel and a really fun way to conclude the course for you. So in this video, we're going to sketch through a quick bio of the author Apuleius. This is, in fact, one of the best preserved ancient novels that we have in the ancient Greek and Roman world, and it's really good that we have it here for you to be able to see. Apuleius also is our later author from the time period that we've been studying. We're now in what's called the Silver Latin period, and he's from a location that we have not yet seen in this course, and that's North Africa. And so we have several distinguishing points about him. I'd like you to please pause your video, go to Sakai under Resources, and please locate handout number 7, the final of the 7 handouts on the authors. This is handout number 7 on Apuleius. Please pause your video and please open handout number 7. Okay, do you have handout number 7 open? Excellent. Let us continue. So Apuleius, as you'll see in the bio section, was born in North Africa. So as we were saying in the previous video a couple weeks ago about Seneca, Apuleius demonstrates once again that the spread of Roman civilization all through the Mediterranean world had the effect of rendering more of its residents spread over a much wider area literate enough to be able to produce literature. So Apuleius himself is from North Africa, born in AD 125 approximately. Like the other authors we've been studying, he was very widely educated in many different places, including Carthage, Athens, and Rome. Some of the literary style we see in his works shows a definitive Greek, especially Athenian influence, and so we could tell that that he was definitely educated in Greece as well as in other parts of the Roman world in quite a wide area. Now, Apuleius had a bit of a run-in with the subject of magic. And that actually shows up in the main work we're going to discuss, The Golden Ass or Metamorphoses. But Apuleius himself apparently had a brush with it. We're going to be discussing Roman magic in a different video this same week. But it's enough to say right now that one of the effects of Apuleius's dabbling in magic, apparently, was that he got prosecuted for it. So apparently he was going to marry someone, and in fact did married the mother of one of his ex-pupils from Athens named Pontianus. He married his mother Pudentilla, but apparently the family didn't care for him too much, and so he ended up being accused of magic. We do have a work surviving from him called The Apology, very similar to Plato's Apology and Xenophon's Apology, those two works, both written in exoneration of Socrates, the philosopher, for his crimes that eventually got him drinking hemlock. In the spirit of those two apologetic works, Apuleius also writes an apology in which he helps to exonerate himself from the charge of magic. We presume that since the trial was somewhere in the late 150s, and Apuleius is certain to have lived at least till AD 170, and probably after that, that he in fact was acquitted of the charge of magic. So we do know that he was a public speaker quite a bit, and also that he was a priest at his home in Africa, and that's discussed in another work of his called the Florida. And eventually, as we say, he passed away after AD 170. So the works that we have surviving from him, the Apology and the Florida, are both the works we just mentioned, the Apology on Magic, the Florida on the rhetorical declamations, and also something about Socrates, since again, he apparently appears to have studied Socrates pretty closely. We have the De Deo Socrates, which describes the special daimonia, the inner spirit that Socrates claims guided him in his lifestyle around Athens when he was carrying out inquisitions of his various colleagues and co-citizens in Athens, basically putting them on the spot and often embarrassing them with what they thought they knew and in fact did not. So that whole Socratic effect, that the Socratic method is explored in De Socrates and is examined from the standpoint of the daimonion, the special private spirit that Socrates claimed to have had that guided him. On page 2 of the handout, we see some of his other lost works. We can tell that Apuleius was a man, as we said before, of quite wide learning, and apparently was able to write pretty notably in several different styles of writing, but the one that ended up being adopted was the Asiatic style, which is quite interesting because even though he was a North African writer, he did not adopt the African style, and there are in fact distinct differences between the African and the Asiatic style. The Asiatic style is a great deal more florid and rhetorical in nature, with a lot of rhetorical flourishes in it than the much drier African style. So he adopted the Asiatic style, and of course, because he had a lot of connections with the East, especially with religion, such as with the goddess Isis, as is shown to us at the end of the Golden Ass, it makes sense that in traveling around the Asiatic world quite a bit, he might well have been influenced by their rhetorical practices. He has quite a bit of rhythm and rhyme also, so somewhat similarly to the way that ancient Greek works were influenced by the sophistic work of Gorgias of Leontini to learn how to write their works more rhetorically with a lot more play on words and rhythm and rhyme and so forth. Such appears also to have been the case with Apuleius. A lot of Greek words, a lot of colloquialisms and such. So Apuleius apparently was a very sophistic, self-educated man, and a lot of that specific education does find its way into all of his works. Obviously, this was a man very widely traveled and very widely cosmopolitan in his outlook. Now, Golden Ass is the best preserved ancient novel that we have, specifically from Roman times. It's a book of 11 books, I should say a work of 11 books. And this shows a really wonderful example of the influence of magic in the ancient Roman world. As we said before, we will devote a separate video to the subject of Roman magic and witchcraft, also tied in, of course, with the Greeks. But in this case, we have the fellow named Lucius, who tries to impress a lady friend of his by getting himself turned into an owl. He approaches a witch asking for a potion that will turn him into that bird. When the witch mixes the potion up, she gets an ingredient incorrectly added in, and instead of turning him into an owl, it turns him into a very handsome donkey. The witch then promises to mix an antidote potion in order to get him turned back in, and she stuffs him away in a barn. Unfortunately, before she gets a chance to turn him back into the donkey, robbers break in and steal the donkey. The witch did tell him that in order for him to get turned back into a human, he would have to chomp on a white rose. He actually passes a white rose bush as he's being dragged away. However, he realizes he better not chew on it, because if he does and he gets turned back into a human, he'll suddenly be this naked human in front of all these robbers with weapons and will probably not survive very long. So he ends up submitting himself to the very ignominious status of donkeyhood. While he travels all sorts of adventures, he encounters many different people, and one of the most beautiful portions of the work is the story that's told by one of the people he encounters to some other people he's with, the story of Cupid and Psyche. This is a really marvelous myth in which Psyche is now the persecuted innocent woman being pursued by her, as it turns out, mother-in-law Venus, the Roman goddess of love, because Psyche is worshipped as a much more beautiful woman than Venus. Venus, of course, cannot stand for this, and Venus wants her son Cupid to punish Psyche, but Cupid, as it turns out, falls in love with Psyche. However, he has her marry him only on condition that she is never allowed to see what he actually looks like. Now, Psyche has two older sisters. The two sisters get jealous of Psyche's wonderful marriage, and they start spreading rumors to her that, in fact, she has married some kind of a dreadful monster. So they insist upon her, they impress upon her the need to get her husband to reveal himself. It's only after Psyche reveals who he is with a lamp late at night that she finds out that he's actually the god Cupid, but she wakes him up by accident, and he rushes off, and she's abandoned. Once Venus finds out what her son Cupid and Psyche had actually been doing all that time, she starts persecuting Psyche with special tasks, like sorting out a whole pile of grains, or going up onto a hill to fetch a pail of water that she can't possibly get to, and so forth. And finally, she ends up having to go down into the underworld to get a box full of Persephone's beauty. She actually does manage to go down to the underworld. She actually does meet Persephone, and she actually gets the box. But unfortunately, when she comes back out of the underworld, it's just like Pandora all over again. She gets curious, and she opens the box, and this vapor suddenly pours all over her, and she falls asleep. But luckily, by that point, Cupid is able to impart upon the rest of the Olympians that Psyche should be rescued, and so eventually Psyche is woken back up, brought back up to the Mount Olympus, the Olympian world, and she is finally granted a special reprieve, and she even eventually is able to get along with her mother-in-law, as it turns out. So all works out very well with the story of Cupid and Psyche, and this is a great example, as we talked about in the satire novel video, of how you have one story interspersed in with the much larger narrative of the poor donkey, Lucius, wandering all over the place. Now, the termination of Lucius's adventures turned out to be in Egypt. He ends up coming into a celebration of the goddess Isis, and the priest manages to feed him the appropriate white rose in order to get him finally turned back into a human, not surprisingly in front of everybody else, so they cover him up very quickly, naturally. And in fact, because of his successful reincarnation finally as a human, he goes through the induction process and eventually becomes a devoted priest of the goddess Isis. And Apuleius, in fact, ends his work with very little more about Lucius and more of a moral editorializing conclusion about the role of proper dutiful religious worship in one's life. So Golden Ass is a remarkable novel. It is, in fact, an entirely prose novel, and there are only about 5 works surviving from us from the ancient Greek and Roman worlds that are all prose like this. Prose fiction was very late in developing, as we talked about in the satire novel video, and this is, in fact, one of the very few examples that we do have surviving. It also shows, as we said before, quite a bit more influence of the cosmopolitan nature of the Roman world. Obviously, Rome had been the center of the Roman Republic back several centuries before, but we can see now with the developing Roman world in its 2nd century, not unlike the Hellenistic period in the Greek world, that as Rome gradually expands and incorporates quite a few more cultures, there's a great deal more cultural cosmopolitan interchange, a lot more traveling, and a lot more education with many of the local customs, religious practices, different aspects of civilizations that these places know. Obviously, a lot of languages that are interchanged amongst all the different residents, a lot of different deities worshipped, many different religious practices, a lot of trade, and so forth that all comes into this. And so we could tell in this approach of the traveling person in distress, Lucius the donkey, we see how Apuleius is able to demonstrate his capacity for the knowledge of the world around him as he tracks Lucius through all these various misadventures. Also, the whole idea of the young man in a predicament is rather similar to the novelistic trope of the young man in love who has to travel in some way in order to eventually get redeemed of something. So remember that in Petronius the Satyricon, the character Encolpius, the narrator of the story, is in difficulties with the god Priapus and has been struck impotent. So in this case, Lucius too has gotten himself into trouble because of his carelessness to trust a witch to turn him into some bird, and so now he has to get himself out of his predicament by eventually getting himself redeemed as a man and finally freed of his asinine appearance. So I do hope that you will study that work very closely. As I say, it's a really wonderful concluding work. Especially make sure that you do read the Cupid and Psyche story. As I say, it's a really wonderful conclusion to your study of Roman myth in this course. So in our next video, we'll take on the subject of Roman magic. And as I say, we're almost done with the course. And before you know it, we'll be ready for your final exam. Okay, we will see you next video.